We're live.
Hello, my name is John Grossman, and I'm a member of the Board of Directors for the Forest History Association of Wisconsin. And I'd like to welcome you to the third session of our fall webinar series titled Lake Narrow Gage, based on a book of that title by Harvey Huston. Our presenter, Mary Andrews, is the granddaughter of the author. For 48 years, from 1893 to 1941, the narrow gauge hauled logs, piling, pulpwood, potatoes, and lumberjacks among the lakes and forests of Wisconsin's Northwoods between Rhinelander and the Three Lakes and Eagle River chain of lakes. Mary's presentation tonight will be preceded by a short presentation by Carrie Bladorn regarding the Logging Museum in Rhinelander. Carrie is the director of the Pioneer Park Historic Complex in Rhinelander, home to one of the narrow gauge system's steam locomotives. As I hand off to our presenters, please consider a couple issues to aid in the success of this webinar. One, note questions you may have for the presenter during the presentation, and then take time to pose them via the chat feature in Zoom at the bottom of your screen. If you're new to Zoom and have challenges navigating the system, you can pose a question to get help from the facilitator using the same chat feature. Finally, when the session is over, please consider completing the short survey also offered in this chat feature. Following the advice that all of life really is connected, you can help us better connect by offering productive feedback and keeping that connection healthy. Now, along with you, we look forward to this evening's presentation.
Good evening, everybody. Carrie Bladorn, Director at Pioneer Park Historical Complex. We are live down at PPHC, as we like to call it, which features one of the premier logging museums in the country. And just going to take you through a couple of the museum buildings and show you what we have here. And hopefully you can come in the future and take a walk around yourself. So without further ado, we are here in the Antique Sawmill Museum, Red Marquardt's Sawmill Museum, which features a sawmill that's over 100 years old, has sawn millions of board feet of lumber up in its day. A wonderful display. Nice piece of planing equipment here. All of this machinery at one point in time was operated by this McCormick Deering tractor. Shot of the sawmill here. Some antique chainsaws. And we're going to take a little walk out the door into the dark. And we're going to head over to the Civilian Conservation Corps Museum here on the grounds. This is one of the most complete Civilian Conservation Corps museums in the country. There are a lot of different CCC museums at various state and national parks. And we're very proud to have a wonderful museum here on exhibit. This is a wonderful replica of a CCC camp building. Features thousands of photographs, documents, artifacts. Many of the items on display here, the vast majority of them taken directly from CCC camps, the end of the era in the 1940s, and eventually made their way here on display. Here's the man of the hour, if you can see him, Mr. FDR. America liked him so much, I believe they voted for him 4 times. We have dozens of wonderful personalized photo albums that were donated to the museum for display. Great little model of what the camps looked like. I believe tomorrow is a fire tower presentation. There's a pre-showing what one of those looks like. Here is a nod to a more current Civilian Conservation Corps, the Wisconsin Conservation Corps. aside from having lots of photographs, documents, etc., we have lots of wonderful CCC artwork, much of which was done by enrollees in camps. Nice collection of authentic CCC used tools. Early model cellular telephone. Say that, of course, with my tongue in my cheek. Model of a dispensary that you might see in a camp. One of the newest acquisitions we have here is this amazing little Victrola, which was in the rec room at a Civilian Conservation Corps camp. Again, dozens upon dozens of wonderful photographs, documents. Example of some enrollees. Uniforms taken from World War I. Various artifacts, patches, items that enrollees would have on them. Sure, some of you are familiar with this statue. These are mock-ups for the original CCC statue called the Worker. I believe there's one on display at Trees for tomorrow. Thank you, Mr. Roosevelt. And we'll be moving along to the next building here, the famous Rhinelander Logging Museum. Much of the materials on display at the Logging Museum are from the Rhinelander area, but it also does branch out into much of the region. And we have equipment, artifacts, photographs from all over northern Wisconsin, primarily from the late 1800s. We are in the blacksmith shop here at the complex. Some marvelous tools on display here. A couple of my favorite artifacts here, the horse snowshoes, bog shoes, swamp shoes. One-man crosscut saw unit. And again, we just won't have the time to go through every single artifact, but there are hundreds of items on display here. This museum was founded in 1932 and originally existed over by the paper mill here in Rhinelander along the banks of the Wisconsin River. And in 1954, it was moved to Pioneer Park as a yeast plant was built next to the paper mill. And here we are in the cook shack wing of the authentic logging museum, logging camp building replica. Wonderful cast iron stove on display. I think about the gazillions of sweet pads, flapjacks, pancakes that were made on this wonderful stove. Very large band saw from a mill in Appleton on the wall there. Wonderful photographs showing millions of board feet of lumber from all different sawmills. This one's from Goodman. And of course, the cook shack would not be complete without seating for 20 plus hungry loggers. Some of you will be familiar with this device that's hanging between the photographs here, survey chain. Interesting to note that just about every acre from sea to shining sea in this country was walked out with a chain such as this one. Excellent display of logging camp stamp hammers on display. I have a couple of neat logs that have washed up on shore over the years, including stamp marks, early survey maps. Tools for measuring logs. I want to point out this wood cookie or wood slice from the Douglas MacArthur pine tree, one of the largest pine trees recorded in the state of Wisconsin, white pine tree. This is a giant 36-inch wide board cut from a single log, and I just find that incredible. Number of neat dioramas which depict logging equipment. And we'll move on into the dingle of the building, the center area. And of course, everybody will recognize this infamous pine beast, Rhinelander's beloved hodag. And we have no shortage of authentic hodags on display here, some of the oldest in the known universe. Here's the one we like to call the Mama Hodag. And here we are in the Bunk House of the Logging Museum, which features more tools. Some wonderful artwork is included in the complex here. This one by a famous Rhinelander resident, William Day. Some great scale models of logging equipment. These models constructed by Gus Bentz of Butternut, Wisconsin, who worked for the Drott Company, held a number of patents on early logging equipment. Some wonderful ox yokes on display. Nice little dray. Again, with the artwork, phenomenal artwork here on display. Here is a wonderful diorama, some logging efforts done by famous Rhinelander resident Lee Mayer. And here's what we like to call the shotgun or muzzleloader bunks, which we have on display here. Just a quick view of the whole room here. Some wonderful dugout canoe specimens on display. Here's a neat little artifact, as this cant hook was left in the woods after it was done being used, and a tree grew up through it, created a natural handle. And unfortunately, it got pretty dark pretty quick considering the season, and won't be able to see some of the larger pieces of equipment. A water tank for ice roads, a wonderful Phoenix steam log hauler on display. We have a set of the big wheels, and I guess you'll have to come next summer when we open up again around Memorial Day and take a look if you've never been here before. And I'm walking down toward the Rhinelander Railroad Museum. And thankfully there is a light down here so we can get a look at the Thunder Lake Lumber Company's 5-spot, number 5 engine, which I won't give too much away about this engine, as Mary is going to talk a little bit about it and the Thunder Lake Lumber Company and its ventures. But very cool to have that on display. Just make out the silhouette of a little locomotive steam engine, which on Friday we will be lifting off its foundation to put a new foundation under it. Give you a little bell action there. I think the neighbors are going to be wondering what's going on here tonight. Maybe some of them are tuned in this evening. And here we are in the Sioux Line Freight Depot. Later it was a mixed-use depot. There's a 5-spot replica made entirely out of walnut shells, Great little specimen in there in the Rhinelander Railroad Museum's library. Some great artifacts, railroad artifacts on display here, a number of lights, signs from various small communities that subsisted on the logging industry primarily in its early days, and some of which are just names on the map today. Here's the number 5 engine, fresh out of the factory in Pennsylvania. The old number 7 engine, which was on display here originally. Again, I'll let Mary tell you a little bit more about that. And we're going to head down to the basement where we have a wonderful model railroad exhibit. This model railroad exhibit depicts 1950s Rhinelander area and shows much of the forestry heritage of the community and beyond. There's a absolutely fabulous display of Rhinelander paper mill. Painstaking work and continued work goes into the construction of this model. Showcases the Sioux Line, the Chicago Northwestern Line, and of course it would not be complete without the Thunder Lake Narrow Gauge or Robbins Railroad. Now, if we can find the Thunder Lake engine is buzzing around here somewhere. I believe the engine on the Thunder Lake Narrow Gauge rail on this display is the number 7, or excuse me, the number 10, I believe. And of course, he's not wanting to make an appearance this evening, apparently. Here at Pioneer Park Historical Complex, it is 7 interconnected yet unique museums in one complex. So there's lots to see. Sometimes people spend a couple days here coming back and taking a look at all there is. Aside from putting the Northwoods' wonderful forestry heritage on display, also features a one-room schoolhouse museum, antique outboard motor and boat museum, so again, we will be open next Memorial Day 2021, God willing. One more little look at the silhouette of the 5 spot. Of course, the museum complex is on Facebook. Feel free to pop over there and like the page. And last but not least, I'd like to thank Mary Andrews for letting me open up her presentation this evening. And thank you to the Wisconsin Forest History Association. And I hope you enjoy Mary's presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you for inviting me to speak to you tonight on my grandfather's book, The Thunder Lake Narrow Gauge by Harvey Huston. I thought you'd enjoy a brief history of Harvey's life to know how he came about writing the logging books. Harvey's love for the Northwoods of Wisconsin started at a very early age, as his family had been traveling from Chicago to the Northwoods since 1912. They vacationed at Coons Franklin Lodge on the south shore of Trout Lake in Arborvitae every summer. Harvey enjoyed the usual freedom of boys in the Northwoods: swimming, canoeing, fishing, building forts in the woods, and general exploring. Harvey then attended Harvard College and Harvard for law school as well, and then worked in intelligence during the war, where he met and married my grandmother, Andre Noel Huston. After the war, Harvey then moved his new bride back to Wilmette, Illinois, where Harvey took a job as an attorney for the Santa Fe Railroad, a perfect fit for a man with a lifelong love of railroads. They had one daughter, my mother, Andre Huston. Then after, they moved to the family home in Monaco, where Harvey lived until his death. In the late 1950s, Harvey's love of railroads and the Northwoods led him to begin research on the Thunder Lake Lumber Company, Robbins Railroad. As he put it, he just wrote it himself when no one else stepped forward. While vacationing in Arbor Vitae, he began traveling back and forth to the Three Lakes area, often meeting with locals to gather the memories and photos. My mother went with him many times, trudging through open land and forest, where he pointed out where the right-of-ways were. At that time, they were somewhat easy to find by breaks in the tree lines. Harvey continued his research from home in Monaco, Illinois, throughout the winters. He was fortunate enough to meet with Jack Melray, a former owner of the railroad, during one of his trips to Wisconsin. Melray had many photographs and many more stories to share of a bygone era. Harvey always felt fortunate to have been able to have met him before his death. The Thunder Lake Narrow Gage book was published by Harvey in 1961 and was awarded the Certificate of Merit from the Wisconsin State Historical Society. The success and popularity of the Thunder Lake Narrow Gage book led to his second book, The Roundhouse Line. The first edition of Thunder Lake Narrow Gage sold out, which led my grandmother and mother to publish a second edition after Harvey's death. In the second edition, they were able to include additional information that Harvey had found out after the original publication, as well as the story of his finding of the number 5 Thunder Lake locomotive, the only engine that had been ordered and purchased new by the railroad, in a magazine on railroads in Mexico. Harvey orchestrated the detailed transfer between Mexico, the Rhinelander Historical Museum, and the Colorado Railway Museum, which culminated in the original Thunder Lake number 5 locomotive returning to the Logging Museum here in Rhinelander, and even better, at no charge to Rhinelander for the return of Engine 5. Unfortunately, Harvey passed away after his retirement in 1979 on the golf course at Trout Lake at the 18th hole. He had enjoyed golf for most of his life, was doing what he loved in the place he loved at the time of his death. I grew up as my grandfather had, spending summers in northern Wisconsin. Our family continued throughout the generations, vacationing at Coons on Trout Lake. However, I was the one that started staying here in the Three Lakes area myself over the summers from a young age on. I split my time between Coons, Honey Rock Camp, and Denby Island in Three Lakes with family. I fell in love with this area of the Northwoods and was able to really appreciate my grandfather's passion as I walked down the old rail beds as a camper at Honey Rock and saw the areas that he spoke of in his books. Spending summers in the Northwoods and my love for this area is what ultimately made me decide to turn our vacation home into my permanent residence here. To talk about the Narrow Gauge Railroad, we have to start back at the beginning. The land of what is now Three Lakes was first inhabited long ago by Chippewa and Potawatomi Indians. They traveled the area by canoes and also established many woodland trails, many of which are now the roads we use today. One of the earliest recorded trading posts in 1860 was established near Virgin Lake and Three Lakes. The Lakeshore Traffic Railroad was the first group to purchase the land in this area from the U.S. government in July of 1881. They purchased sections of land along the right-of-way over a 60-mile stretch between Monaco and Watersmeet, Michigan. The railroad sold the timber to lumber companies to offset their own expenses. This section was later sold to the Milwaukee and Lakeshore and Western Railroad in 1884, and then finally sold to the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad in 1893. With the arrival of the railroad to the area, so also came settlers, and so began the use of the land and natural resources for economic development, agriculture, and recreational purposes. The Robbins Railroad, located in northeastern Wisconsin, operated on a gauge of 36 inches rather than the standard 56.5 inches of the Chicago Northwestern. This was important because the smaller tracks allowed it to more easily travel through the woods and over different terrain. It served as a common carrier from the time of its incorporation in 1898 until abandonment in 1941, which made it the Middle West's last narrow gauge common carrier. The operation of the Robbins Railroad was tied closely to the private narrow gauge logging lines operated by the Thunder Lake Lumber Company and its predecessors from 1893 to 1941. The forest products always provided the great bulk of the traffic of the narrow gauge, so inevitably, Thunder Lake Narrow Gauge is logging history as well as railroad history. During the 1840s, logging developed rapidly in Wisconsin, particularly along the Wisconsin River, which offered a natural waterway for log drives. Logging was slow to move north through the upper Wisconsin Valley because of the difficulties offered by the many rapids, and especially Grandfather Falls, 36 miles below Rhinelander, where the river dropped 100 feet in less than 1 mile. However, 1/3 of the stands of pine in the entire state of Wisconsin were north of Grandfather Falls. The Fox and Helms Lumber Company began the slow task to supplement the waterway by an overland route. In the winter of 1857 and 58, a road was cut along the east bank of the Wisconsin River, north from Merrill, which was then called Jenny, to Pelican Rapids, at which point it cut across the county following the Ontonagon Trail blazed by the Indians long before, past Sugar Camp Lake and Indian Lake to Eagle River, where a few farmers had been raising hay. The road between Pelican Rapids and Eagle River is now substantially the route of State Highway 17, and it was paralleled for many years by the narrow gauge between Rhinelander and Indian Lake. In the spring of 1858, the first log drive in the upper Wisconsin Valley proceeded from Eagle River down the Wisconsin to Little Bull Falls and Mosinee. During these early years of logging in this area, lumber producers generally cut only the pine, leaving behind the unwanted hardwoods, spruce, and hemlock. They also usually only cut in winter, so that teams of ox could haul the logs on sleighs to the riverbanks. Soon, the logging industry began to develop rapidly in the northeastern Wisconsin area. In the early 1870s, the Cone and Curran logging camp was established at Otter Rapids on the Wisconsin River below Eagle River. In 1874, Edward Brown, who had been engaged in logging near Stevens Point, bought hundreds of acres of land at Pelican Rapids from the state of Wisconsin. Because of the difficulty in navigating the Wisconsin River in that area, the Brown family offered half the land to the Milwaukee, Lakeshore, and Western Railroad, now part of the Chicago Northwestern, then building northward from Milwaukee to Ontonagon, Michigan on Lake Superior, in return for building a branch to Pelican Rapids. The branch was built west 14 miles from Monaco Junction and was put into operation in 1882. A town site was laid out, and the community was named in honor of F.W. Rhinelander, the president of the railroad. That same year, Abner Conroe put up a portable sawmill in Rhinelander, and this was soon followed by the Brown Brothers Lumber Company sawmill. Within 1 year after coming of its first railroad, Rhinelander's 2 sawmills were producing 15 million feet of lumber per year. The Wisconsin River was dammed at Rhinelander, and the backwaters formed Boom Lake, making a storage area for huge quantities of logs. In 1886, S.H. Baird and F.S. Robbins organized a partnership, Baird and Robbins, which was the original firm of the various partnerships and corporations owning or operating the narrow gauge through the years. The Baird and Robbins sawmill was built on the southeast shore of Boom Lake, but it was not until 1893 that the firm built a railroad. In 1888, the Sioux Line, persuaded by a donation of real estate by the Brown family, opened its line east from Minneapolis into Rhinelander, and its tracks came close to the shore of Boom Lake, where most of the sawmills were located. By 1892, 8 sawmills were in operation around Boone Lake, and Rhinelander was 10 years old, with a population of 4,000. In the early days of logging in the Rhinelander area, the timber was cut, usually only in the winter. Ox teams hauled the logs on sleighs to the river banks. After the spring thaws, the logs were rolled into the rivers and floated downstream to Boone Lake. The operations of Baird and Robbins followed the same pattern. Around 1890, the firm was logging in the vicinity of Sugar Camp Lake, to the north of Rhinelander, where as early as the 1850s, there had been a maple sugar camp in the hardwood belt. Drays were used to haul the pine, spruce, and hemlock and balsam logs from Sugar Camp Lake southwest to Mud Lake, from which point the logs were driven down Pine Lake Creek to Pine Lake, floated across the east end of the lake, and driven again on the Pine Lake Creek south into Boone Lake. Hardwood logs, however, were too heavy to be driven down the lakes and rivers, where they would sink. One spring, the water in the rivers was so low that the usual Baird and Robbins log drive could not be accommodated, and that is how the narrow gauge got started. Interestingly, there are many areas on these lakes and along the chain that logs got stuck in the water, especially in the bays where they had wandered off course and sank. Many can be seen on the bottom of the lakes, even now if you look closely enough. It was spring of 1893 when the low water in the Pine Lake Creek thwarted the customary Baird and Robbins log drive from Sugar Camp Lake to Boone Lake and Rhinelander. Prompt action was required. It took the form of building a 36-inch gauge railroad from the north shore of Boone Lake, northeast about 5 miles to Pine Lake. After the success of this 5-mile stretch, the railroad saw the potential of adding additional lines to bring the logs down to Rhinelander. The railroad then extended an additional 7 miles into the area of present-day Sugar Camp, from Pine Lake, passing along the east shores of Jenny Weber Lake and Lost Lake to the south shore of Sugar Camp Lake. At this point, a sawmill and small village were established, followed by a post office named Robbins. A railroad station was erected at Robbins, but operations were directed from the east shore of Pine Lake, where a 3-stall roundhouse, shops, and employees' boarding house were built, with the group of buildings being commonly referred to as headquarters. For several years, around the turn of the century, there was an adequate supply of logs for the Browns-Robbins to operate sawmills in both Rhinelander and Robbins. The timber of the Robbins and Sugar Camp Lake area came largely from the Browns-Robbins own holdings and consisted mainly of hardwoods and pulpwood. A network of spur tracks were then built beyond Robbins to serve the many logging operations in the area. The principal trackage went northeast from the Robbins Depot to Camp 5, southeast of Indian Lake, from which point one spur headed east to the north end of Thunder Lake, where it was only 2 miles west of the Three Lakes Depot on the Chicago Northwestern. A longer spur went northeast from Camp 5 to the Brown Brothers Lumber Company logging operations at Columbus Lake, 5 miles south of Eagle River. Until 1898, the Little Narrow Gauge Railroad was merely a private logging line that tied directly into the operations of a lumber producer. New dignity was acquired April 15th of 1898 when the Brown and Robbins Railroad Company became a Wisconsin corporation. The narrow gauge thus was granted the power of eminent domain and was authorized to construct and operate lines of railroad already constructed or that may thereafter be constructed, specifically including the lines from Rhinelander to Sugar Camp Lake, with 16 miles of track excluding spurs. Apparently, W.H. Brown was no longer active in the business even in 1898, for his name was not listed among the original incorporators of the narrow gauge. From February 18th of 1901, the name of the railroad was changed from the Brown and Robbins Railroad Company to the Robbins Railroad, and on the same day, the Brown Robbins Lumber Company became Robbins Lumber Company. When a newly incorporated Robbins Railroad was becoming adjusted to the regulation as a common carrier, changes were taking place, not only in the logging in the Rhinelander area, but also in the map of the narrow gauge's operations. Most of the pine timber, which was particularly sought after by the lumber companies, was being cut out. And in 1899, 4 of the 8 Rhinelander sawmills shut down. While 1900 saw the last log drive past the Rhinelander on the Wisconsin River. Robbins Lumber Company, however, consumed large quantities of hardwoods, and thus was not dependent solely on the supply of pine logs. In addition, in 1903, officials of the Brown Brothers Lumber Company, an important receiver of logs from the narrow gauge for many years, played a leading part in establishing the Rhinelander Paper Company, and Frank Robbins, president of both Robbins Lumber Company and Robbins Railroad Company, became the vice president of the new paper company. This mill received large quantities of pulpwood via the narrow gauge until the abandonment of the railroad 38 years later. In 1905, a busy year, Robbins Lumber Company had in operation day and night 2 sawmills and 2 planing mills, producing 30 million feet of lumber per year. Some important changes in trackage occurred about 1902. The principal project involved construction of a trellis from the north shore of Boone Lake across the lake at the so-called Narrows directly into Rhinelander. This improvement eliminated the necessity of floating logs across Boone Lake from the railhead on the north shore. In addition, direct access to the various mills in town was provided by placing a third rail on one of the Sioux Line standard gauge tracks to accommodate the Robbins narrow gauge equipment. Extensions of the narrow gauge during the early years of the 20th century were not accomplished, however, without meeting obstacles in the form of persons who did not see eye to eye with some of the expansionist plans of Frank Robbins, who was the dominant figure in managing the narrow gauge in its first 26 years. The more prolonged controversy was with the Chicago and Northwestern Railroad. The Robbins Lumber Company had acquired a large acreage of timberlands to the east of Three Lakes, several miles beyond previous logging operations. In order to proceed through Three Lakes, it was necessary to cross the Chicago and Northwestern line that extended from Monaco Junction northward to Watersmeet, Michigan. Attempts were made to cross the lines north of town, near the Thunder Lake area. However, the Northwestern Rail Company fought all efforts. After a few years, the 2 rail companies eventually agreed to a crossing location about 3 miles south of town. They proceeded to construct an overhead crossing of the Northwestern line at that time. Robbins did have to construct a new 9-mile extension of the narrow gauge eastward from the south end of Jenny Weber Lake, and after reaching the Northwestern line, the line continued northeast an additional 6 miles to Lake Julia, where construction was completed in 1909. This entire 50-mile line was built as a private railroad of the Robbins Lumber Company and not part of the common carrier Robbins Railroad, thus avoiding an application to the Railroad Commission for a certificate of convenience and necessity. This construction also marked the last great expansion of the narrow gauge, except for a few spurs in the Lake Julia area during Frank Robbins's long career. Physically, at least, the Robbins enterprises now were at the peak. The narrow gauge had 31 miles of line, consisting of the 16-mile common carrier Robbins Railroad from Rhinelander to Columbus Lake, and the 15-mile private line from Jenny Weber Lake to Lake Julia. Operations were conducted with 4 locomotives, 100 log cars, 5 boxcars, and 1 passenger car. In the summers, Robbins Lumber Company employed 130 men in the woods, and in the winter the numbers expanded to 300, while 150 men were employed in the sawmill and planing mill in Rhinelander. Frank Robbins was 77 in 1919 when he decided to cut back on some of his activities, and let it be known that the sawmill, railroad, and timber holdings were for sale. One day that summer, Jack Melray of Wausau, representing a group of lumbermen, walked into Robbins' office at the sawmill, told Robbins he understood that his properties were for sale, and asked where they could talk business. Robbins informed Melray that they could talk matters over right then and there. So standing at the counter and in the presence of the office force, the two men reached an agreement whereby Melray's group bought all properties of Robbins Lumber Company, including Robbins Railroad Company. Then begins the next phase of the Narrow Gage's history and its greatest expansion, transitioning it more from the Robbins Sugar Camp area to the Three Lakes area and beyond. John Melray was already an experienced lumberman at the age of 33 when he took over the direction of the Narrow Gage. He, along with his principal associates, organized the Thunder Lake Lumber Company and incorporated it into Wisconsin in 1990. The last logging operations of the Robbins had been in the vicinity of Lake Julia, and Melray proceeded to make that trackage the new main line of the Narrow Gage. Ironically, although the new company received its name from Thunder Lake, the branch line to that locality had been torn up some years before, and one of Melray's first acts in 1919 was to abandon 3 miles of spurs in the vicinity of Robbins. The following year, use was discontinued of the old main line between Jenny Weber Lakes and Robbins, and in 1921 the track was taken up, leaving the common carrier Robbins Railroad with only 6 miles of lines between Rhinelander and the junction with the line to Lake Julia, which then became known as Robbins Junction. Although the common carrier portion of the Narrow Gage was no longer had either equipment or employees of its own, and freight tendered to it as a common carrier was handled by a lumber company's trains, the other portion of the Narrow Gage, the private logging line eastward from Jenny Weber Lake, underwent a vigorous program of extension and improvement. A new woods headquarters was established at the point where the Narrow Gage crossed State Highway 32, just east of Virgin Lake. The location was known as the Thunder Lake Store because of a retail dry goods and building material business that was established there, as well as a 2-stall engine house, coal bin, boarding house, and commissary for stocking the logging camps. Thunder Lake Lumber Company took over and operated the existing narrow gauge equipment. Melray was dissatisfied with the lightweight locomotives, and much of the rail was replaced by heavier rail, and the trellis and bridges were strengthened. The Thunder Lake Company's first major line extensions during the 1920s included a 3-mile spur northward near the east shore of Big Fork Lake and an 8-mile line east from Lake Julia to the Pine River. A report was found that said 1929 was a peak year for the Thunder Lake Lumber Company, which showed they had 900 employees, owned 16,000 acres of timberlands and 3,000 acres of cutover lands, with timber rights on an additional 12,000 acres and an estimated total standing timber at 168 million feet. They had a sawmill on a 40-acre site in Rhinelander and had 40 miles of track, 6 locomotives, and more than 200 log cars. Logging camps were constructed in various places throughout the operations of the railroad. The lumber company generally had 2 logging camps operating simultaneously. During approximately the first decade of the narrow gauge's existence, Robbins Lumber Company operated a total of at least 5 logging camps. One camp, Camp 13, was abandoned as a logging camp during the early 1930s, but the site was utilized by the Civilian Conservation Corps for a camp for use engaged in conservation and reforestation work under an agency of the federal government. The typical camp had a bunk house with capacity for 50 to 100 men and double-decker bunks, stretching in 2 rows, foot to foot. There was also an office cabin, plus cookhouse, locomotive house, and a horse barn. In the early years, kerosene lanterns provided the only illumination, but the last few camps were equipped with electric lights and heat was provided by wood-burning stoves. Each camp had a telephone service, which was particularly useful in controlling train movements and coordinating timber cutting with the operations of the mill. The camps were required to furnish a steady flow of logs to keep the sawmill operating without a breakdown, and the sawmill crews were required to unload the log cars promptly so that an adequate supply of cars was available at the camps. The trees were felled by 2-man teams of sawyers. The hardwoods were cut in the winter when sap was in the roots, and the hemlocks were not cut until the ground had hardened following the spring thaw. Horses were used to skid the logs out of the woods. and steam or gasoline-powered log loaders hoisted the logs onto the cars. In addition to the logging carried on by the lumber company crews, independent contractors, known as jobbers, engaged in cutting timber on small and frequently isolated tracts of forest land and delivered the logs to the nearest point on the narrow gauge, receiving compensation according to the total amount of logs supplied. In some areas, the timber tracts were too widely scattered to justify building of a spur track. Timber from these areas was brought by 60-ton gasoline tractors, operated in the winter on ice roads that were 20 inches thick. Each tractor could haul a train of 10 to 20 sleighs loaded with logs. And in some areas, as many as 25 rail carloads of logs per day were received in this manner. The ice road near Camp 6 on the Pine River line was not built without encountering certain unanticipated obstacles. When Foreman Jack Bell cut this ice road in 1925, he found that the only feasible route was along a small creek tributary to the Pine, cutting through an old beaver dam. The industrious beavers repaired their dam each time that it was disturbed. In desperation, the railroad appealed to a game warden who found it necessary to trap the beavers and move them to another location. But not until his first attempt was thwarted by the beavers, who not only repaired their dam, but simultaneously buried the trap in the mud. The logging activities of Robbins and Thunder Lake lumber companies were conducted on lands of varying ownership. In many cases, the lumber company owned the land outright, while in other instances, ownership attached only to the timber rights. Logs furnished by jobbers were cut from timber on land belonging to themselves or third parties. Much of the land owned by the lumber companies, particularly in Forest County, was purchased from the Chicago Northwestern Railroad, which had received it earlier in the form of land grants from the United States. A relatively small part of the logging was performed on state forest lands. Railroad operations in any particular area were of limited duration. As a result, logging spurs were seldom were used more than 1 or 2 years, and as the need for the particular spur terminated, the 30-pound rail was taken up promptly and relayed on the new spurs that were being built as rapidly as the old spurs were being abandoned. During the late 1920s, as many as 25 miles of spurs would be relocated during a single year. Accordingly, it is very difficult to attempt to define precisely the trackage of the narrow gauge at any given time. And the maps we have show all the trackage without indicating the years in which each portion was in operation. In 1928, the Argonne Preserve portion of the Nicolay National Forest was inaugurated in Forest County on cut-over land purchased from the Thunder Lake Lumber Company, with the initial transaction covering 14,000 acres. The federal government reached the conclusion that since it required 50 to 75 years time for trees to mature in northeastern Wisconsin, private lumber companies could not realistically be expected to pay even minimum taxes on cut-over land for such a long period of time. So the cut-over lands were acquired as national forest additions with the ultimate objective of instituting a selective cutting program. As the Thunder Lake Company saw ours advance, the federal government purchased additional cut-over land, provided that the small trees had been left standing. Popple, birch, and wild cherry sprang up quickly after the big trees had been cut, providing shade to protect the slow-growing hardwoods. The land acquisition program utilized in the development of the Nicolay National Forest was a prominent source of income for the Thunder Lake Company in the 1930s. The lumber company, as part of the program, sold 29,000 acres of cut-over land to the federal government during the Depression years. An additional 15,000 acres were sold later in smaller parcels as soon as timber was cut. In 1908, Frank Robbins sent a letter to the state where he predicted that the Three Lakes Eagle chain of lakes from Big Lake North to Eagle River will eventually be the greatest summer resort in Wisconsin. This area unquestionably has developed as one of the principal recreation areas in the state, and the 18 miles of lake frontage held by the Thunder Lake Lumber Company became an important supplementary source of revenue. Jack Melray refused to let his lumberjacks cut the timber close to the shorelines, and the company maintained a steady business in selling lots at $5 to $10 per linear foot on the lakes. Furthermore, purchasers of lots could buy building materials for summer cottages at the Thunder Lake store, and if desired, the company would also build the cottage. During the Depression years, most of the married men were kept working. Lumberjacks were typically bachelors, though. All salaries, including Jack Melray's, were cut by 50%. Melray told my grandfather that he still cherishes a letter written to him November 18, 1932, by foreman Jack Bell of Camp 15, on receipt of word of this drastic pay cut, in which he stated simply, "Friend Jack, your letter regarding wages received, and I am glad to be working. Will look after your interests the same for these wages as I would if they were double. Hope times pick up next spring so you come out on top." Throughout the years, the Thunder Lake Company would have various sorts of entertainment for workers and locals. They maintained a cabin on the east shore of Big Fork Lake that was used for entertaining customers and also as a base for partridge hunting trips. Fishing was always a favorite activity. Around the turn of the century, Frank Robbins developed a thriving Sunday excursion train business. Robbins would sponsor picnics and baseball games and would occasionally hire special entertainment talent. Many such excursions with the passengers carried in the single coach, as well as box cars and gondolas equipped with benches, would attract from 200 to 300 patrons. Jenny Weber and Sugar Camp Lakes were the scenes of many of these outings, but his favorite spot was also Indian Lake. About 150 Indians lived at the campground at that location around 1900, and Robbins would frequently hire them to perform dances. On one such occasion, as an engineer was about to handle an excursion train from Rhinelander to Indian Lake, he was approached by an ignorant banjo player looking for work. Sensing that the patrons would be pleasantly surprised by mixing banjo music with Indian dances, the engineer Smith hired him for the day and provided him with a box lunch. But the real astonishment was on the part of the Indians of Indian Lake, who assumed that the banjo player was a rare species of Indian and demanded to know the name of his tribe. The excursion trains were not always operated for the purpose of making a profit for the railroad. In 1902, the parishioners of St. Cunacunda Catholic Church, located on spur of the Narrow Gage, just west of Sugar Camp Lake, instituted a building fund drive. Many of the Robbins Lumber Company Polish loggers attended this church, and Frank Robbins agreed to operate a special train from Rhinelander to Sugar Camp Lake on the day when the fundraising carnival was to be held. En route, Robbins took over operation of Locomotive 2 from engineer George Smith and sent Smith and a fireman through the train to collect tickets. Several $100s in fares was collected in this manner, and the entire proceeds were turned over to St. Cunacunda Building Fund. By 1941, the area had essentially been logged over. There was no longer enough standing timber to continue operations. An application was filed with the Wisconsin Public Service Commission, seeking authority to discontinue the 6-mile line of the common carrier Robbins between Rhinelander and Robbins Junction. Since all the trackage between Robbins Junction and Butternut Lake was a private line, it was not necessary to seek authority from the state to abandon that part of the railroad. A hearing was held in Rhinelander, and with no oppositions, authority to abandon the line was granted promptly in June 1941, and the corporate existence of Robbins Railroad was dissolved as of August 1941. A crew of 6 men, plus a foreman, made short work of dismantling the track. The 300-pound rail used on the wood spurs had been sold at a profit after more than 50 years of use. Log and boxcars were dismantled, and the metal parts melted down in a Wausau foundry. A strong effort was made to remove the pilings from the longest trestle, all 1,400 feet of it, across Big Lake, in order to minimize interference with the navigation. But among the 75 bends, a few stubborn pilings were left that can still be seen today. Maps today will show the location of this trestle as Dog Lake. However, all veterans of the Narrow Gauge will say it's part of Big Lake. To quote my grandfather, unlike many railroads that had been abandoned because of some sort of financial disaster or other calamity, such as diversion. Sorry, it cut out there. Such as, to quote my grandfather, unlike many railroads that had been abandoned because of some sort of financial disaster or other calamity, such as the diversion of traffic or a flood that was washed away the railroad bed, there was a certain dignity about the death of the narrow gauge. It has carried out its purpose of transporting logs economically and efficiently. Its credit was good, with all obligations disposed of. Its termination was simply the inevitable outcome of the exhaustion of a natural resource in an area where 50 to 75 years are required to replenish that resource. The timber resources are now being replenished in the Nicolet National Forest that includes many thousands of acres of lands that were logged by Robbins Lumber Company or the Thunder Lake Lumber Company. And it seems appropriate that many portions of the old narrow gauge right-of-way are now being maintained as fire lanes. Thank you all for inviting me to speak on my grandfather's book and the unique history of the narrow gauge railroad. Also, thank you, Carrie, for presenting first. I did want to add that my grandfather's books, The Thunder Lake Narrow Gauge and the Roundhouse Line, as well as two poster maps, are available. You can contact Carrie at the Rhinelander Historical Society for them, or the Three Lakes Historical Museum sells them as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. We have a few questions in the chat. And so if you want to enter the questions, go ahead. Mary, you can turn your video on if you want. And you already answered one of the questions, which was, is the book still in print? And it is. And then there was one question for you, Carrie. What do you mean by a mixed use depot? I think when you were in the Sioux Line depot, you mentioned a mixed use depot.
So when the Sioux Line came to Rhinelander, they built two depots, a passenger specific depot, which was on Sutliff Avenue in Rhinelander near the paper mill, where the rail line came into town from the west. And they also built a freight depot, which was down in the freight or Sioux yard, down near what we call the Hollow in Rhinelander, on the intersection of Phillip and Thayer Street. The passenger service east and west just wasn't feasible to maintain. So at a certain point in time, the passenger depot was sold to a number of different entities, eventually becoming the Rhinelander Paper Mills lab and used for storage. And the freight depot down in the Hollow, down at the Sioux Line yard, was then turned into a mixed use depot, which was able to facilitate freight and passenger service. It seemed like the passenger service in those days of rail travel in Rhinelander was more north and south and less east and west. So hopefully that explains the question.
Okay, other questions? Mary, I had a question. I used to live on Indian Lake a long time ago, on the north side of Arbutus Drive and Ripco. And
I live on Indian Lake, actually, myself in Arbutus.
So, just walking around out there, you can find little spurs. Did they have lots of side spurs to collect wood in various areas? Because I mean, it seemed like everywhere I went, I would find a railroad spike.
Yeah, there were a lot of lines through that area in particular. As you know, on the east side of Arbutus, it's all managed forest lands for the most part. And back in there, they had a lot of lines that kind of went to the various camps. And one thing with the narrow gauge, because it was the smaller size, it was easy for them to pick up the tracks and relocate them as needed. So it's hard to know exactly how many spurs went through that area, but as you know, you can kind of go through a lot of these areas throughout there in Three Lakes and find spurs, pieces of nails, things like that, all through that area. One other side comment on that, the bus driver for my kid's school lives just south of Highway A to the east of Highway 17 in Sugar Camp. And he owns some large parcels over there. And he actually found kind of the site where the derailment of the engine that my grandfather talked about in the book occurred, because he had found bent pieces of metal and different pieces that kind of went along. So there's a lot of stories kind of in the area that people have found things, and a lot of neat history kind of all through there.
So we have a question from a member, Ed Forrester, asking, are there, the question just jumped on me. Are there volumes of logs? Do they have volumes of the logs hauled documented by year for the company?
I think there were some logging. Carrie, do you remember if they've got the actual records?
We do not have any records of any of the operations aside from which you have explained, Mary. Unfortunately, I'd love to get my hands on some if some do exist.
Yeah, I think it's hard to find some specifics by year. I know they found kind of little bits and pieces here and there, but not the full, documentation.
And I'd imagine it kind of depends on the company and how the records were maintained and handed down through the years. Let me see here. I guess this is a comment. Ties used on the Sioux Line and now a fence behind the new gas station has the dual gauge spike holes. This is at the current red flag of the CN North Yard.
Yeah, as I had mentioned, with the Sioux Line and Rhinelander, they ended up adding that additional trackage so that they could haul the trains through there.
I'm gonna have to check that out.
Yeah, me too.
Sounds interesting.
I see there's a question here, Tom, regarding the CCC Museum at the complex and accessing it. The museum complex, along with the CCC Museum, is open Memorial Day through Labor Day, 6 days a week, and then through September, Fridays and Saturdays. We just ended our official season, and we tend to put the complex in what I call hibernation for the off season. So typically the complex and the CCC Museum would not be accessible. Although with a lot of work we're doing on the 5-spot train engine down at the complex, I'll be around through October. If you'd like to get in touch with me, we can certainly make arrangements to have you in there to access those materials if you'd like to. Otherwise, you're welcome to come next season, and there's always a docent on staff that's happy to help you research and peruse the archive.
There was a very similar question in the Q&A about having access during the winter time, but I think you've answered it very well. So. All right, I'm just double checking the Q&A and the questions, and I'm not, lots of comments about how people enjoyed it. Let's see here. I'll just read one here. It's kind of long, but that's okay. Mary, I enjoyed your presentation very much. I first read the Thunder Lake Narrow Gauge in 1971 when I started researching the Lakeshore and Eastern Railroad. I was searching for data and photos of locomotives. Come to find out your grandfather published Roddus Line in 1972, and one of their later locomotives, number 102, was purchased from the West Lumber Company in 1936, a subsidiary of another railroad company. And evidently this John Berg communicated with your grandfather about a lot of these photos. And so much like the trains and the tracks and everything were shared and moved on to other companies, so did the history. It's kind of interesting. Carrie, Ed Forrester's wondering if you have a meeting room there at the Pioneer Park complex.
A meeting room. Technically, the only building at the complex that's heated through the wintertime is the Rhinelander Railroad Museum, the Sioux Line depot. And so there is space there with a table and some chairs. But otherwise, during the summertime, we oftentimes have gatherings in the cook shack of the logging museum.
The park also has various shelters that you could meet in after a tour or something like that. One additional question related to the Rhinelander, but not necessarily the Thunder Lake Narrow Gauge. I've heard numerous times that the Sioux served the CNW locomotives at the Sioux Roundhouse opposite as to what they did in Marshfield. Can anyone confirm that this actually happened?
This is a conversation that I've been a part of on several occasions with a number of local historians. And to everyone's knowledge, the Chicago Northwestern had a headquarters in Anago, and they had quite a large complex there. They also had a roundhouse in Monaco, which is just east of Rhinelander. But they also had some small facilities at Rhinelander in the early days for several decades. Later on, after the Chicago Northwestern yard was decreased, they did in fact have some contracts with Sioux, but from my understanding, it was a little bit of a gritty relationship with the heavy competition.
Yep, they were heavy competitors, that's for sure. And so they probably wouldn't have wanted to help each other out too much. A question about the presentation being available. It will be posted to our YouTube channel in a few days here. So it'll be available there. I do want to say it took me a minute or two there was a microphone that needed to be muted, and it took me a minute to find it. So I apologize for that, but we got through it and got back to the original sound. So. All right, not seeing any other questions. John, you want to give the closing remarks?
Great stuff, Mary. Once again, I think we've got a real winner in a presentation here, and something that'll be online and I think sought after for a long time. So great job from both of you in what you offered to our group tonight. I want to remind folks to please take time to offer us some feedback on what we did right and maybe what we could do better in the future. Our presenters really thrive on that stuff, and we as an organization need that in order to improve as we go forward. So please take time for that whenever you can. Remind you that tomorrow night, we've got another presentation on the history of trees for tomorrow. Started as a leadership training camp for the CCCs and morphed into a premier natural resource learning center that it is today. So I think it's going to be an interesting program tomorrow. And next week, we'll have a talk on elk and on fire towers. So I think those will also be well offered and enjoyable if you take the time. Please know that some piece of our purpose as an organization is outreach to K-12 educational systems. So as you think about the remarks you might offer us, we're always interested in advice on how we can do better to do outreach in that arena. With that, Tom's reminder that this will be online, as all of the programs being offered in this webinar series will be captured and placed online for future viewing if you want to see this again and take better notes. So thank you one and all for the presentations offered by our presenters, and for all of those of you who took time to participate. Our expectation is your feedback will help us grow, and we need that. So thank you one and all, and I hope perhaps you'll join us again for another of these offerings.